First, let me thank Professor Betsey Price for having initiated the idea for this special issue of the journal, and for enormous effort and supervision that has made the production of it achievable. Welcome and thank all the participants and the listeners for your presence. Thank Guido for organizing the Zoom logistics from Mannheim, and thank the York University Digital Scholarship Library team that hosts the electronic phase of the journal. On behalf of the entire editorial team of the GIDEA, I would like to express my deep indebtedness to Jacques and Hyun as guest editor for having mounted an impressive manuscript. Before we start, and for the general listener, I would like to say a few words about the remarkable eclectic scholar we honor today. Nanak Kakwani is a pure product of the finest Indian Delhi School of Economics, school led in his formative youth by other inspiring giant scholars, Chakravarti, Amartya Sen, and Bhagwati, to mention only a few. Kakwani's relentless theoretical and empirical endeavor was and still is to give his attentiveness to the state and faith of underprivileged human beings. Kakwani belonged to that very small group of selective thinkers who, while grappling with complex issues, are able to come up with convincing, simple conceptions, be it an idea, a formula, or a principle, that end up having a profound impact on the advancement of knowledge. Some examples. French philosopher Sartre, using simple words in his plays about human nature, managed to unscramble the intricate issue of essence and existence. John Hicks, with his simple concepts such as the elasticity of expectations, the principle of compensation, his notion of factor substitution, advanced considerably the understanding of Paretian welfare economics. Similarly, Kakwani, a very powerful mathematical mind with acute sense of intuition and observation, has, with his conception of many simple measurement indices that bear his name, provided the tools needed to help implement economic redistributive policies. An example of his ingenuity is his impressive success in transforming the polemical, Bergson, non-commensurable social welfare function into a practical and usable tool to compare aggregate welfare levels of different countries. From a different slant, Kakwani challenged Arrow's impossibility theorem to assert that even a meaningful ranking of such comparables is possible. Like a magician, over the years, Kakwani has pulled many rabbits from the hat. He continues to surprise us in pulling out yet more. Witness his latest contribution with OUP. And like the magicians whose rabbits are illusory, or unlike economists whose rabbits are most prototype toys, Kakwani's are real and alive. One of Kakwani's rabbits of late is his pro-rich, pro-poor growth contribution. The question as to whether prosperity derived from economic growth benefits everybody has been controversial since the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and has continued to be so ever since. In this particular debate, Kakwani has made his. In the study of international trade, where it has been established theoretically and unambiguously that under the hypothesis of comparative advantages, there is always gain from trade. it is yet to be proven, theoretically or empirically, that trade always benefits everyone. Similarly, a prevalent belief is that under free and checked market forces, prosperity derived from economic growth benefits all, and as a consequence benefits the poor. Kakwani challenged this claim theoretically and empirically. Most, if not of all Kakwani's theoretical and empirical contributions, have one final aim: to devise some redistributive mechanisms, be it through transfer, fiscality, job policy, investment, incentive, etc., from which policy recommendations to alleviate unfair economic disparities can be derived. Kakwani's methodological approach to the issue of poverty is elegantly simple, pedagogically powerful, and compelling, persuasive. Take the example of his borrowed definition of deprivation. If everybody but Y has X and Y does not, then Y is deprived. X is not just the income or purchasing power. It is access to education, health, nutrition, water, sanitation, mobility, job opportunity, etc. In the age of cyber technology to this set of X's, one can add access to information, credit, and security, and climate change. Deprivation for Kakwani has an intricate multi-dimensional ramification which he manages skillfully to disentangle. From a simple understanding of deprivation, he devises his own measurement index that can capture the lack of having a certain level of X, as well as the deviation of one's level of X in relation to what others have. To conduct his empirical work, Kakwani does not satisfy himself with whatever official data is available. Like Marco Polo or Ibn Battuta, whose path of knowledge led them to the Far East, Kakwani is also a modern global trotter, in constant search and investigation of meaningful measurement of needs to express these X's. His learning path took him to Brazil to investigate firsthand how employment policy can help reduce inequality, to China to study the impact of programs of poverty reduction, and to many other countries where he has journeyed, too numerous to mention. Obviously, there are numerous permutations of how one can correlate all these X's. There are many specifications one can suggest. The choice of data is wide-ranging and selective. Thus, Kakwani's empirical findings can be challenged on the basis that his conclusions are or are not conclusive. The fact remains, however, that being the first to have expressed all these intuitive ideas and to have pioneered leading research puts him in the pantheon of economists. Kakwani's enduring scholarly compassion and optimism are laudable. Thank you, Professor Kakwani. It is an immense privilege and great honor to have you present with us today. Thank you, Jacques and Hyun, for having made the manuscript in honor of Kakwani possible. I now let Jacques take over.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in today's event in recognizing Professor Kakwani's important contributions to the field of poverty, income inequality, and tax progressivity. I also thank the Journal of Income Distribution for dedicating special issue in honor of Professor Kakwani in these areas and inviting me to be one of the guest editors of the special issue. When Professor Price first approached me to be a guest editor of this special issue, I was both excited and slightly anxious. I was very thrilled to be part of this special issue, and at the same time, I thought this exercise carried in it a huge weight, considering Professor Kakwani's vast experience and his prolific career in the field. Also, having never published in the journal before, I was initially a bit reluctant to take on the role of a guest editor. But luckily, I had Professor Jacques Silber to share this opportunity with, so I was quite lucky in that sense. If there were two things that I've done smartly as a guest editor, one was reaching out to Professor Silber to be my co-guest editor. As you know, he's one of the leading scholars in this field. And the other thing I did very smartly was identifying the initial list of the contributors for the special issue. Professor Silber was a bit more conservative in determining the contributors, while I was bolder in proposing that we invite leading scholars in the field, including Professor Jenkins, Professor Fields, Professor Kunal Sen, Professor Ravalian, Professor Lasting, Professor Lee, and Professor Chakrabarti. This special issue is something that I will be truly proud of when I look back at it, say after 10 years. And while it will be impossible to fully capture the magnitude of Professor Kakwani's work, we hope that this special issue does justice to his contribution to the field. So with that, I will hand it over to my co-guest editor, Professor Silber, to talk about Professor Kakwani's work and also our contributors in more detail. Okay, over to you, Jacques. Thank you.
Thank you, Hyun. Thank you, Professor Hamouda. Let me start by a citation which I found in books that Keynes edited in 1951, Essays in Biography. There he wrote, "The master economist must possess a rare combination of gifts. He must reach a high standard in several different directions and must combine talents not often found together. He must be mathematician, historian, statesman, philosopher in some degree. He must understand symbols and speak in words. He must contemplate the particular in terms of the general and touch abstract and concrete in the same flight of thought. He must study the present in the light of the past for the purposes of the future. No part of man's nature or his institution must lie currently outside his regard. He must be purposeful and disinterested in a simultaneous mood, as aloof and incorruptible as an artist, yet sometimes as near the earth as a politician." Well, Professor Nanak Kakwani, in whose honor we edited this special issue, has in our eyes most, if not all, of what Keynes considered as the required feature of a good economist. He is one of those rare economists who made important contributions at the theoretical and methodological level, published numerous and careful empirical studies in the field of inequality, poverty, and related topics, but also accumulated a vast experience in advising government and international institutions. His CV confirms the breadth of his knowledge, since it indicates that his research areas include econometric theory, applied econometrics, applied welfare economics, proper growth and policies, inequality and poverty, progressivity of taxation and equity, standard of living and well-being, social protection, price indices, poverty and labor market linkages, and development economics. Professor Kakwani obtained his PhD from Delhi University in 1967, but a close look at his CV shows that by then he had already 7 publications in academic journals, among which 2 in Econometrica and 1 in the International Economic Review. In 1984 and 1985, he was awarded the Mahalanobis Memorial Gold Medal by the Indian Econometric Society for outstanding research in quantitative economics. He has published more than 100 papers in leading international journals, including 9 papers in Econometrica and 6 books published by well-known publisher, Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, Palgrave Macmillan, and Edward Elgar. But as mentioned previously, Professor Kakwani has also a vast consulting experience with international organizations such as the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and UNDP. It has indeed been a great privilege for Hyun and me to work with Nanak Kakwani. As far as I'm concerned, following the 2005 International Conference in Brasilia on the many facets of poverty, a conference that launched the International Poverty Center, of which Nanak was the first director. Following this conference, I edited with Nanak 2 books as well as a special issue of World Development on multidimensional poverty analysis, conceptual issues, empirical illustration, and policy implication. Hyun and I were therefore very happy to have been asked to edit this special issue of the Journal of Income Distribution in honor of Professor Kakwani. The 8 papers of this issue all deal with topics that belong to research domain in which Professor Kakwani worked and to which he made very important contributions. We hope that this issue will be a nice tribute to Nanak's remarkable accomplishment. Let me end this introduction by thanking the Journal of Income Distribution Editor-in-Chief, Professor Omar Hamouda, and the journal director, Betsey Price, for having asked us to edit this special issue. I also want to thank Roberto Iacono, Guido Neidhofer, and Michele Raitano, co-editor of the Journal of Income Distribution, with whom Hyun and I were in close contact while editing this special issue. Naturally, those who most deserve our thanks are the authors who contributed a paper to this special issue, and I will not list the authors since there are also quite a few co-authors. Finally, let me also thank ZEW for proposing as well as organizing the launching of this special issue. And now let's hear the invited speakers.
Right, Jacques, shall I go? Yeah, I have, I guess, just under 10 minutes. Yeah, I'm in business. I'm talking about redistributive effect and the progressivity of taxes and benefits. So it's straight Kakwani, folks. I'm doing this is work with Nicolas Hérault. So salute you, Nanak. We know that you've made many significant contributions to the analysis of inequality, poverty, and the progressivity of taxes and benefits. In fact, bringing those 3 topics together in one tight framework, as I shall remind people. And as the other speakers have said, you're a scholar across many domains, but what I'm talking about today draws on your particular knowledge about Lorenz and concentration curves, the relationships to each other, and to the Gini. And although the Gini is rather special, some people would say, the fact that your insights are so great that your approach has stood the test of time, and that's in effect why I'm picking it up. I'm going to illustrate a Kakwani approach to study the trends in redistributive effect and its decomposition. So let's remind ourselves of these famous decompositions. We're in a situation where we have the income before the government comes, let's call it pre-fisc income, summarized, the inequality summarized using the Gini GX. We have a post-fisc income, which is Y, similarly inequality due GY. Redistributive effect is the difference in inequality, subtracting one from the other. And what Nanak's wonderful insight was that you could decompose redistributive effect into two components. Initially, we forgot the re-ranking one, but that came along later. But essentially, we have the vertical redistribution of taxation, which depends on two components. The first one here is related to average tax rates. This is related to T. And we have the economist Kakwani Tax Progressivity Index, which is summarizing deviation from proportionality. And then there is a term on the end, the re-ranking index. So what we've got is this key aspect of summarizing redistributive effect and relating it to two aspects in particular of the tax system, which may change independently. Moreover, you can do the same thing for benefits. So here's an analogous formula, and you can put the two things together and look at both taxes and benefits. So that's Nanak's framework that we draw on. Our application is to take a fresh look at the UK situation. Unusually for a statistical office, the UK Office for National Statistics has been producing reports about the effects of taxes and benefits on household income annually for years and years and years. But we thought we'd take a fresh look at it by using this comprehensive framework to be able to summarize this detailed picture for the very whole period. So a wonderful way of advantage of this approach is to be able to look at things in this way. In the main paper, we look at both cash benefits and in-kind benefits. We look at direct taxes and indirect taxes. But today I'm going to focus only on direct taxes and cash benefits. Direct taxes in the UK mean income taxes and social insurance contributions, and local taxes, basically council taxes. And there are lots of different types of cash benefits. Our work is different from past research because they've focused on either taxes or benefits, but not all of them. And they don't have such a long and detailed time series of data. The other thing we offer in the paper is an innovative counterfactual approach to assess whether the trends in redistributive effect that I'm going to show you are primarily associated with changes in progressivity, one of those components in the vertical redistribution part, or is it changes in average taxes or benefit rates? We also talk about various empirical implementation issues, such as the definition of the pre-FIS distribution, and show that it matters, but I'm not going to talk about that now. So the background, folks, is what's shown on this chart. There's more information to look at. I'm going to highlight the cash benefits trends and the direct taxes trends for redistributive effect, first of all. And keep in mind that UK recessions in particular were in the early 80s, in the early 90s, and in the early 2010s after the Great Recession. So if we look at redistributive effect up here and measured in terms of Gini percentage points, you can see that the picture for cash benefits, redistributive effect, has sort of gone up a bit over time, but most noticeable are these bumps that correspond with the times of UK recessions. I'll come back to that. If you look at direct taxes, you've also got redistributive effect broadly increasing more clearly, but there is not the same association with recessions. Now, if we then break it down into the various components, remember the first component of vertical redistribution is to do with those little t or little b. If we look at taxes, you can see this in this gray line. It's basically a sort of shallow U shape and then another little shallow U shape over there, but varying over time, not much change over the whole period. On the other hand, for cash benefits, what we see is the same sort of fluctuations that we're also seeing in overall redistributive effect. I'm going to come back to that. What about progressivity? Well, again, focusing on taxes and benefits. At the top of the picture, we see for direct taxes that up until about the beginning of the 90s, the tax progressivity, according to Nanak's index, was roughly constant, but then has increased, broadly speaking, over time, going from around 10% 10 points in our index here through to 20 at the end. Cash benefits, well, it's negative because it's working in the other way, an equalizing effect, unlike direct taxes. You can see it's progressive, getting larger at the beginning of the period up until the Great Recession, and then relatively constant. Now, let's think about, if we think about those trends in redistributive effect over time, what's been driving on them? I'll tell you now that it's not re-ranking, so we don't have to focus on that. But the counterfactual idea here is to say, is it the changes in the average tax rate or its average benefit rate, or changes in progressivity over time that are matching those trends that we saw? So what we're doing is going back to our formula. Here we're starting with benefits, effectively ignoring this term at the end, fixing it at the mean value, but then alternative projections. First, we can fix the B at the average rate and then see what happens to K over time, and see what then happens to the overall redistributive effect, or reverse things. Fix progressivity at the average rate and change the B with the actuals and see what happens. And this is what happens in the pictures here. So what we see here is what in the previous picture, the dark line shows the redistributive effect of cash benefits in the UK over this period. Then the gray line is what happens if you fix the B and keep the other things varying, keeping D constant as well. And then we've got so that's this one. You can see it doesn't track the actual very well. Or you can fix progressivity and allow the average amount to change. And what you see is a remarkable tracking of the fixed progressivity series with the actual series. So basically the trends in redistributive effect of cash benefits in the UK over this long period are largely associated with the cyclical changes in average benefit rates. We can do the same for taxes, direct taxes, exactly the same sort of counterfactual exercise, either fixing the average rate or fixing progressivity. But we now get the opposite conclusion. So here is the dark line is what we were seeing before in terms of the actual changes in redistributive effect of taxes. But now what mimics it is this gray line, which is the fixed average rate series. So basically what's going on here is that the fixed average rate series is tracking the average series. So I'm going to finish there and just show you that what I've demonstrated here is that the framework that Nanak gave us so long ago is immensely useful. Many other papers have applied it. This is yet another one in the series, and it's shown how you can use it to provide a comprehensive framework to analyze a lot of data and see what's going on. Thank you very much.
Should I proceed? Oops. Okay, you're seeing my screen, correct? Okay, good. All right, well, I am going to pick up on the other main strand of Nanak's work, which is inequality and poverty. And I've entitled my paper, Pro-Poor Growth Meets Dualistic Development. Nanak and I have been working on inequality and poverty for decades. And one of the aspects of his work that I had not worked on myself was pro-poor growth, of which there was a flurry of activity 20 years ago. And so when I was invited to join this tribute to Nanak, which I was very pleased to accept, I thought, let me check and see what's been going on with pro-poor growth since I first learned about it. And so I emailed Nanak to ask him, what is pro-poor growth about today? And here is what he said. He said that the term pro-poor growth is used in at least 3 different senses. One is relative pro-poor growth, where the poor benefit proportionately more from growth than the non-poor. Absolute pro-poor growth, which is greater absolute benefits, that I would call those dollar benefits or whatever the currency unit is, as opposed to absolute value. And poverty-reducing growth, which is a third use of the term. Growth is pro-poor if it reduces poverty. So I thought, well, keeping those.
Gary, you've muted yourself.
I'm very sorry. Okay, now you can hear me. All right, my mistake. Okay, can I just go back then and say that, so while you can hear me, that that the contribution I'm making is to the inequality and poverty stream of Nanak's work, in particular the pro-poor growth aspect that he brought up 20 years ago. And here are the 3 definitions that he proposed when I contacted him as I began to write my paper. All right, keeping these definitions, possible definitions in mind, I then wanted to relate pro-poor growth to something that I had been working on for a long time, which is dualistic development. And so dualistic development is the idea originated with Arthur Lewis, and at least in my mind, Lewis was where I first encountered it, his work for which he won the Nobel Prize. Simon Kuznets in his famous AER paper in which he had urban and rural sectors, and growth was, the 2 sectors were at different income levels and had different levels of inequality. And so in both those traditions then, the 2 sectors, which I will call modern and traditional, we could use other names for them, it's not important. Dualistic development, I wanted to put forward 3 possible patterns of growth. One is what I labeled modern sector enrichment, which enrichment meaning that in that sector, incomes are rising. So that's incomes rising in the modern sector, incomes holding constant in the traditional sector. Traditional sector enrichment is the opposite of that, incomes rising in the traditional sector, no change in incomes in the modern sector. And in both of those, the number of people in the 2 sectors is held constant. Modern sector enlargement, on the other hand, is where there are shifts of population, what some people call the Kuznets process, and that the share of the population in the modern sector increases, and there's a corresponding reduction in the share of the population in the traditional sector, holding incomes in the 2 sectors constant. So these are 3 stylized dualistic development types. The title of the paper is Pro-Poor Growth Meets Dualistic Development. So the question is, what happens if you put these together? In particular, what can we say about the pro-poorness of each of these 3 types of dualistic development? The main conclusions that I reach, and I'm going to show you examples of these, is that the pro-poor growth measures work well. Pro-poor growth measures work well for the 2 enrichment growth types. That is, if the people in the high-income modern sector are getting richer, or if the people in the low-income traditional sector are getting richer. We run into difficulties when we look at the pro-poor growth measures for modern sector enlargement, which is where the 2 income levels, the income levels in the 2 sectors remain the same, but they're changing weights as people move from the traditional sector into the modern sector. And how do we get around these difficulties? I'm going to show you a new axiomatization to get out of the difficulties. But first, let me tell you what the difficulties are. So, well, first, I'll tell you the axioms. The axioms for pro-poor growth are divided into three categories. One is axioms for poverty measurement. It's completely standard. We've learned how to measure, how to axiomatize poverty from Atkinson and a whole lot of other people. Nothing new there. Axioms for pro-poorness. Rebellion and Chen proposed some axioms. Kakwani and Sun have said, well, we like these axioms. We adopt them. These two axioms are that the pro-poorness measure should be consistent with the direction of change in poverty, and that the measure of poverty used in measuring pro-poor growth should satisfy standard axioms for poverty measurement. I find those completely acceptable, and so I'll use them. The third set of axioms, the pair of axioms, is new, and this is for axioms for dualistic development. And what I wanted to suggest is that pro-richness and pro-poorness are distinct orderings. And so pro-richness in the context of growth would be where an increase in the incomes of the anonymous rich, and let me just say this is all about using anonymous data, not panel data. That's what the pro-poor growth literature did. An increase in the incomes of an anonymous rich person holding all other incomes constant contributes to pro-richness. In other words, all incomes are the same. A rich person gets richer, that's pro-rich. Holding all incomes the same and raising the income of an anonymous poor person contributes to pro-poorness. And so, given those ideas, I'm going to talk about two examples in a minute. Here are the two examples. 5 people, 2 income levels, and economic growth taking place. And I'll talk about them more on the next slide. Excuse me. Take example 1, where to begin with, 4 people have an income of $1. 1 person has an income of $5. Economic growth takes place. One of the people who had an income of $1 acquires an income of $5, gets richer. The richer person, to begin with, still has $5. The poorer people, to begin with, except for the one whose income rose, still have $1. To me, that's pro-poor. That's exactly the pro-poor axiom that I put forward on the preceding slide. So that doesn't pose a problem. Now let's take a second example. Here what we have are still 2 incomes, but now 3 things happen. One thing that happens is that one of the anonymous poor from the initial distribution got rich. Second thing that happened is that the incomes of the remaining anonymous poor increased. So they got richer as growth took place. And the third thing that happened is that the incomes of the anonymous richest increased. So the rich got richer. The poor got richer, the rich got richer, and there are more rich. So what do we want to say about that? According to my axioms, the ones I just suggested on the slide before, this growth pattern, which remains completely dualistic, there's still 2 incomes, 2 sectors, it is both pro-poor and pro-rich by my axioms. So it's to make such statements and say, here's what happened in this kind of economic growth, uses more words, but it's worth it, I would say. So that's where I want to conclude is that if we take apart where the patterns of income growth and perhaps income decline were in the income distribution, we can simultaneously have both pro-poor and pro-rich economic growth taking place according to this axiomatic set. Thank you.
I think I'm speaking next. So let me start by first saying that I'm really pleased that I was invited by Dr. Silber, Hyun to contribute a paper to this special issue, and I'm really pleased that that we could be a part of this amazing collection of papers. The paper jointly with Ira Gang, Rajesh Raj, and Hyun. Some of these authors you're probably familiar with. This paper is a paper that looks at the gender productivity gap in the Indian informal sector. Let me put the full screen on. And what I think we want to say at the beginning is that this paper kind of links very much to what we're already discussing in this webinar. We know that Nanak has contributed fundamentally to understanding of inequality, and especially the question about inequality of social tensions and how inequality can contribute to social tensions, and social tensions are bad for the economy and more generally for society. We know that Nanak has provided an umbrella under which we can think about past work on inequality, as well as new work in understanding also the implications of inequality of social tensions. So we don't necessarily think this paper is a paper as a direct consequence of reading. So this paper is a direct consequence of reading Nanak's work, and especially on what she has contributed on implementable and measurable social functions within social tensions. So we do not directly link our work to the concept of social welfare functions as such, but it is nevertheless very important in the way we formulate the question in this paper, dictating the path our analysis follows, and independent results that we have in this paper. So we just want to make it that, and I want to make the point that we do see this paper linking very much to Nanak's interest in inequality and social tension. So the paper is really is about gender inequality, but in a slightly different way than has been studied before. We know, as the bank says in the WBR 2012, that gender inequality is like gravity, present everywhere with far-reaching implications. Now, if you look at the question of gender inequality, much of the work has been on gender inequality in labor markets, around gender wage gaps, gender difference in labor force participation, and there's been a lot of work, especially for developing countries. But there has been less interest in literature on gender difference in firm productivity. And that's what we want to focus on in this paper. But at the same time, we know, and this is a very important issue, because female micro-owned enterprises face significant disadvantage as compared to male male-owned enterprises. And so that's something that obviously needs to be looked at, and we're going to try and do that in this paper. So what we're going to do, our contribution in this paper is to look at the correlates. It's not a causal paper, it's a descriptive paper. The correlates of gender differences in productivity of male and female-owned firms in the Indian informal sector. As some of you know, we've been working on the informal sector. The set of authors who've been working on the paper for several other papers too. So it's a continuation of that work. Of course, it's pretty obvious if female-run firms disproportionately exhibit lower productivity, then it's likely that women who operate these firms are going to be less successful in escaping poverty and improving their living standards than the male counterparts. So it's really important to understand why, if at all, female-owned firms are less productive than male-owned firms, especially in the informal sector. The reason being that the majority of the owners of less productive informal enterprises form India's working force. As you probably know, that India has about a very large share of the informal sector in total working population, estimated around 75 to 80% of India's working population are in the informal sector. Now, we are fortunate that we have very rich data for this paper. We use the 73rd round of the India's National Sample Survey Organization survey, which has about 300,000 data on 300,000 firms, around 230 male-owned firms, around 40,000 female-owned firms. And it's about unit level data for this from the survey. Now, the first thing that stands out when you looking at the kernel density plots of firm productivity by gender is you can see clearly the male-owned firms in the red on the left-hand side of this slide are more productive than female-owned firms, especially on the bottom end of the firm of the productive distribution. So you can see right away that there's a large gap here at the bottom end of the productive distribution, which is log level productivity, but not much in the higher end of the productive distribution. In other words, when female-owned firms are very productive, they're as productive as male-owned firms, when they're not so productive, they're much less productive than male-owned firms. And that's also very clear in the quantile plot on labor productivity logs. You can see again at the bottom end quite a big difference, and also towards the top end, when you can see at the middle end of the distribution, we see a very little difference at all. So that's something we right away observe, that we do see a large difference in productivity, labor productivity, between male and female-owned firms in the Indian informal sector. When we look at it by quantiles and percentiles, you can again see clearly the difference all across the board, but especially in the bottom end of the productive distribution. So that's right away something that needs to be explained. Why do we see this? So just to summarize this, productivity of male-owned firms is higher than that of female-owned firms across all percentiles. The mean gender productivity gap is 17 points. You can find that the gap increases quickly up to the 40th percentile, and then falls steadily. The gender gap productivity is widest at the bottom percentiles and lowest at the top percentiles. Now, being the bottom percentiles of being also where the poorest of the poor are, that obviously need to be why we need to understand why that's happening. And of course, one important point here, and this sort of motivates the methodology we use in this paper, is that really focusing the mean productivity gap is not so useful. So we see big differences across the distribution of productivity across male and female firms. So I'm going to just jump on the rest of the results. I'm on the Study of Income. We use O'Haka decomposition. The O'Haka decomposition as we usually use is for the mean differences. As I already noted, that would not make sense in this particular context. So I'm using the decentered infinite function approach, which has been developed by Silber et al. In many different papers. And here, I'm not going to go into the exact way it works, but basically the intuition, and most of us know O'Haka decomposition very well in labor economics, is that there is a composition effect and a structural effect. The composition effect is the difference in output characteristics between male-owned and female-owned firms. Structural effects is the difference in the returns to those characteristics between male and female-owned firms. And right away, we can see that the structural effect, the returns to characteristics, is significantly more than the composition effect, the difference in the characteristics of these firms. We have a bunch of characteristics that correlates here. Firm characteristics, we have social group differences. They are in India, that's very important. We have very differences between different social groups in India. We have regional effects, which are state level dummies. We have industry level fixed effects, and so on. Again, I'm not going to be able to get into all of these, but essentially what we think might explain what differences across male and female owned firms, we introduce them in our decomposition approach. So first point, decomposition, we see structural effects more important, 75% versus composition effect of 25%. And interestingly, what the really important difference is in the composition effect is firm characteristics, and in structural effect, to a lesser extent, firm characteristics, the sectoral effect, which are industry level effects. So the bottom line is we seem to be seeing more of a story around structural effects and around firm characteristics. And I'll get into exactly what they are in a minute. Again, just to summarize what we saw in the results already, we can see that the structural effects are dominating across the distribution, but they're most important in the middle part. The selected part of structural effects are the highest between 20 to 60 percentiles, around 80 to 85 percentage points, whereas it is the lowest, the 90 percentile. So you can see the structural effects dominate across the board, all the entire productive distribution, but it seems to matter most in the middle part, is exactly where we saw the big productive gaps between male-owned and female-owned, the middle and the lower part. So which factors explain the gender productivity gap in one slide? It's the firm characteristics, which are essentially firm size, age of the firm, whether the firm receives assistance from the government, whether the firm receives state authorities, whether the firm maintains accounts, has contract work, and so on. There's a bunch of things that are there in the survey we can use. We also see that regional effects, state level differences also matter, and we also see that industry level effects matter. In other words, which industries this enterprise are also seem to matter. And that's also quite important. So let me just end by saying that what we try to do in this paper is to follow up in what Nanak always has this deep interest in questions of egalitarianism and fairness in societies, we focus on one specific type of inequality, one with great social costs, the economic inequalities that we observe across males and females. And we do it with a very specific angle here, which is that we look at the differences in productivity between male and female-owned firms in informal sectors, where we find that male-owned firms are more productive than female-owned firms, which has obvious consequences for poverty and inequality going forward. We also find that, interestingly enough, the productivity gap, gender productivity gap, is particularly observed in the bottom and middle part of the distribution, and less evident in the most productive male and female-owned firms. So it's a very something we see more at the lower and bottom, middle end of the distribution. And we see that among the observable characteristics that we have in the data, the most important contributing stage of factors that explain the gender productivity gap are firm characteristics, both for composition and structural effects. So that seems to be the key finding from our composition analysis. And just on the policy side, one important policy implication that comes out is that if it is the case that firm characteristics make a big difference in explaining the gender productivity gap, there is a need for training programs for female perpetrators in maintaining accounts, for example. This is one of the things that one can think about, as well as facilitating the registration of the enterprises with state authorities. But the bottom line is that to try and do something with the gender productivity gap, especially for the poorest of for the ones that are least productive among female-owned enterprises, there's a need to focus on how one can spend and support to this particular kind of enterprises by various policies. I'll end here. Thank you.
Okay, I guess it's my turn, so I'll go on unless somebody stops me. I hope you can hear me and see the screen. So it's an honor for me to participate in this event in honor of Professor Kakwani's legacy. To be clear, I was asked to provide some commentary, some general comments. I don't have a paper in the issue. And so just briefly what I thought I'd do is start from the big picture a little bit. Some of this has already been said by Jacques, Silber and Hyun. Professor Kakwani has had a distinguished career spanning over 5 decades. In his CV, we see that he was a lecturer at the University of Birmingham in 1966, just as he was about to get his PhD from the Delhi School, I guess. And he has taught and researched and directed institutions in at least 8 countries that I could count: the UK, India, Australia, the Philippines, the US, Finland, Brazil, my own country, and China. As Jacques already said, he has over 100 articles in peer-reviewed journals, including 9 in Econometrica. And along the way in that distinguished career, he's made seminal contributions to a number of fields, including econometric theory, tax incidence analysis, progressivity issues that Stephen talked about today, and that Nora's paper that we couldn't see today, but also are about that. He's got a lot of work on inequality measurement, and not only on the theory of measurement, but on the empirics and the econometric properties around statistical inference for Lorenz curves and scalar indices of inequality. And he's also, as we heard from Gary Fields and others, he's also done a lot of work on poverty and pro-poor growth, and this is where I want to focus. My comments today, and in particular, I want to start by reminding you very briefly about the Kakwani elasticity of poverty with respect to growth, which was proposed in his 1993 paper with co-authors, where he was looking at Côte d'Ivoire, and therefore an additive class of poverty measures. He just defines a partial elasticity, that is to say, the effect that growth in the mean of the distribution would have on a poverty measure if the Lorenz curve was held constant. And he does that for a number of such poverty measures. That is to say, when you take the individual poverty index, which I've denoted little pi here, you can get, very elegant closed solutions, very elegant formula for a number of them. Possibly for the most well-known one, the Foster-Greer-and-Torbeck class, Kakwani and his co-authors developed this quite nice form here, which allows you to get this partial elasticity of poverty with respect to growth, just from things you'd be calculating anyway, like different alpha, different orders of the poverty index. So say if you had data already about P2 and P1, the poverty gap and the squared poverty gap, you would already have the elasticity for P2, and this is also for the headcount index. So that elasticity captures the effect of growth directly on poverty when distribution doesn't change. And so then it was natural, I think, for Professor Kakwani and his collaborators, including Hyun, who's here as well, to think of pro-poor growth in terms of a comparison between the actual elasticity, the observed elasticity, so when these derivatives are not partial but total, and their partial elasticity. So if the actual elasticity was higher than the partial elasticity, you've got a poverty equivalent growth rate, as they called it, greater than 1, and otherwise you get it less than 1. And these are simple ideas, but they have had huge impact, I think, in the thinking around poverty and growth. And they feature in at least 2, but I think in more than 2 of the papers in this special issue of the Journal of Income Distribution. We've heard about Gary's paper a little bit today. There's also a paper by Martin Ravallion called Growth Elasticities of Poverty Reduction, where he assesses strengths and weaknesses of the Kakwani elasticity and provides, some new empirical results, some new data on observed elasticities, noting along the way that there are, changes in distribution are frequent. And so, although on average, the partial elasticity globally will tell you a lot, in the case of a specific country or a specific growth episode, there will typically be a difference, as Professor Kakwani always knew, between the full and the partial elasticities. And it reiterates, of course, the point that these elasticities are specific to a particular poverty index. You could have a growth episode, we could draw a growth incidence curve that would give you a positive elasticity for one measure and a negative for another one. So you could have even that kind of big difference. And in Gary's paper, which I don't want to summarize because he's already done it very well, there's this idea of dualistic development. There's a traditional sector and a modern sector. And he argues, as we heard, that these measures of pro-poor growth work quite well for 2 types of growth episodes, the pure enrichment of the traditional sector, the pure enrichment of the modern sector, but not so much structural change, which he calls the enlargement of the modern sector. And although he didn't show you the Lorenz curves today, in the paper you can see that the reason this can cause a problem or pose a problem is because there are ambiguous changes in inequality in this particular process. The Lorenz curves cross. So all of this reminded me of a distinction that I made in a chapter I wrote for the Oxford Handbooks on the economics of poverty 10 years ago or so, that, looking at the economics of poverty, the literature can more or less be classified into macro, meso, and micro approaches. And the 2 approaches that we've seen, the ones in the special issue, the one that Martin is focusing on and the one that Gary are focusing on, are examples of what I call the macro approach in Martin's case, when you summarize the relationship between a development process and poverty. This is the standard sort of equation of the poverty growth triangle in the Bourguignon sense. When you summarize all this by one number, by one elasticity, you're taking a macro approach, I called it. When you're looking at sectors and differential growth rates and differential elasticities across sectors, you're taking what I called a mesoeconomic approach. And so I want to spend a couple of minutes talking a little bit about the micro approach and how I think it complements the other two. And the what I call the micro approach was just basically building on what's happening at the level of the individual or the individual household, which ends up relying a lot on this notion of the growth incidence curve that Ravalian and Chen proposed in 2003, which just gives you, dy here is the time derivative of income. So it just gives you the growth rate at each percentile, as people here know. This is, for Brazil, a good period with growth and inequality declining, a bad period with negative growth and inequality rising. We all know what the growth incidence curve looks like. And I note in that paper that you can actually just express the growth rate, so the macro growth rate, at least as you get it from a household survey in a mean, or changes in poverty, or even changes in a certain class of inequality measures. All of them are basically differently weighted aggregations of the growth incidence curve, which is a nice thing because it links the micro picture that you got here to the more macro sort of summary statistical measures. In the growth case, the weight is the income share of the individual in percentile P. In the poverty case, it's a function of the poverty measure, right? It's the sensitivity of the poverty measure. And in the inequality case, what's really going to matter is the gap between changes at percentile P and changes in the mean, weighted differently depending on the mathematical properties of the inequality measure. So just think, since we're talking about poverty and a lot of what Professor Kakwani did and what Martin and Gary were thinking about was the relationship between poverty and growth, just focusing for a tiny little bit longer on this changing poverty equation here. We've got, what is the change in poverty? Well, it's a function of where growth is occurring, weighted by how sensitive the poverty measure is. So if it's the headcount index, it's going to be very sensitive just around the poverty line. Otherwise, it's going to be sensitive below it. And so because this eta function can vary a lot is why the elasticities can be quite different depending on what P you're using, which is one of the points that Martin is drawing attention to. But the other reason I want to mention this is that there's a link to what Gary was talking about. So if you just do this derivative here of P with respect to time, when P is given by that additive function that we had before, you get a term outside of the integral here, which is basically the extensive margin. It's what's happening to poverty in the neighborhood of the poverty line. And that's the exits and entries into poverty. It's precisely the sort of, guy that had one, the household that had one and goes to 5 would be captured by this term in Gary's paper. And then the last thing I want to say is that these micro approach can also be used to shed light on something about the nature of changes in poverty through the compositions of the growth incidence curve. You could have a counterfactual income distribution that allows you to differentiate, to decompose the incidence of growth in a country. Here's again Brazil. Let's look between 1995 and 2012. And you can say, well, this was the growth. This is what comes from, say, changes in endowments, and this is what comes from, say, changes in returns. Now, I didn't know that Kunal was actually going to use exactly the same object in his presentation. What he had there was a decomposition effectively of the growth incidence curve for productivity. He used the RIF regression. This particular example also uses the RIF regression in a paper of mine with Sergio Firpo and Julian Messina. But the broader point is that, these brief reflections I'm offering you here, but also most of the work on the relationship between growth and poverty reduction in the last 30 years, whether it is of the macroeconomic, the mesoeconomic, or the microeconomic approach. It all really drew a lot of inspiration from Professor Kakwani and his co-authors' pioneering articles in the 1990s and 2000s. So huge thanks, again, as Stephen said, particular to Professor Kakwani, but also to all of you. And I'll stop sharing with that. Thank you.
Professor Kakwani, the floor is yours.
Should I be speaking now?
Yes, please. The floor is yours for your comments. Thanks a lot for your participation. It's an honor. Professor Kakwani, whenever you would like to start, the floor is yours.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Let me take you back 40 years. The Journal of Income Distribution is one of the oldest journals in the area of income distribution. And I published a paper in the journal more than 40 years ago. And I didn't know at that time that after 40 years, the journal will bring out a special issue in my honor. So I'm very overwhelmed and also humbled to receive this honor. And Dr. Guido, a distinguished senior researcher in the labor market and social insurance, has organized this event, calling it Kakwani's Legacy on the Study of Income Inequality and Tax Progressivity. So this event gives me a great inspiration, for which I'm so grateful to him. I also want to express my gratitude to Omar Hamouda, editor-in-chief of the journal, Betsey Price, the managing editor, our journal manager, for initiating and bringing out this special issue of the journal in my honor. So the organization committee of the journal has also provided their complete support to this special issue. And I'm particularly grateful and thankful to Jacques Silber and Hyun for editing this special issue. They worked hard to ensure that they assemble the best scholars in the field. So 7 distinguished academics have made significant contribution for this journal. Nora Lusting sent me an email saying that she won't be able to attend this event. So I miss her a lot because I know her for a long time. And so I'm humbled that scholars of such distinctions have written papers to honor me. I'm so grateful to them all. And I also enjoyed Chico Ferreira's presentation about my work as well as his new work published in 2012. So what I see, what I gather, I have greatly enjoyed the papers presented here about my work. So actually, I have learned more about my work a lot from listening to these papers. And all authors, they have skillfully used my work, which I could not have been able to do it. So I thank everyone for coming, and so greetings to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, one and all, and to Professor Nanak Kakwani, we are absolutely thrilled to have your presence here. My name is Betsey Price, and as you kindly introduced me as Journal Director of the Journal of Income Distribution, I have the august pleasure to close this session. I might have opened it, but for technical difficulties. So I thank all of you for carrying on so well, so efficiently, and so seamlessly until this point. I've had the pleasure of being able to listen in as a fly on the wall to hear much of the proceedings. And in closing, I can only say that it's actually more of a pleasure to be able to close the session than it was perhaps to have opened it and had the perhaps hopeful wish that it would proceed well, but it has gone absolutely beautifully. I thank all of the participants, as all of you here, with the exception of Nanak Kakwani, know this has been an extreme honor for us to have the August Professor with us. We have launched this project a long time ago, as Professor Kakwani is well aware, and as our guest editors, both Jacques Silber and Hyun are well aware. These ideas they emerge, and then when they take fruit and yield the fruits that we have today, we are extremely, extremely grateful. So to all considered who have played a part in this, from the guest editors and the participants in this particular session that we've heard, but also all the contributing authors. And as Professor Kakwani has alluded, there are 7 august papers in this issue, and many of them have co-authors. So while Professor Lustig was not able to join us today for personal reasons, and we regret highly. It is also unfortunate that none of her co-authors was able to step up and take her place to represent the paper, because it is the contents of all the papers, as Professor Kakwani has just alluded to, that have been so enlightening and a real refresh of many of his ideas and a new take on some of them. So it's with this great pleasure that we will bring the session to the close. But before I do want to acknowledge that the framework for the entire process that we have just enjoyed has been the Journal of Income Distribution. As Professor Kakwani noted, it is a journal now of some longevity, which is not the case for all journals. And it is a journal that has, from its very outset, been extremely intent on remaining highly eclectic in all of the content that it will receive and entertain through scrutiny, of course, high peer-reviewed scrutiny for publication. So we can only say that with that longevity comes a lot of archival volume, and we do make all of that open on our website. So please, to all of you for whom the journal is a bit of a new publication out there, do become apprised of its existence. We do have an online presence, which you can find by just simply Googling the Journal of Income Distribution. And of course, you will, if you subscribe, and it is a platform which is a subscriber platform. So do please subscribe, and perhaps this will be the little tickler to get everyone involved. We have wonderful numbers here, and the exposure is fabulous. So in this digital era, we have this advantage, perhaps, of contacting the world in a way that a journal, which is really only has been up until about 2006, the overtures were made to get it into a digital platform. So we do have a digital version of every issue, as well as a print issue of several of our issues. In the past, we printed every one. Now it's really with only these very, very special issues that we have push the means forward to put them into print. All of the contributors today will receive copies, complimentary copies of this particular issue. And of course, it is available to subscribers for print or electronic or a combination of the two. There are individual subscriptions and there are institutional subscriptions. So I don't mean to be shilling totally for the journal, but it is a wonderful publication and I do encourage everyone to subscribe. Behind every publication, obviously, is a team. And while a few of us have a visual exposure here, obviously you've met the editor-in-chief of the journal, Professor Hamouda, who has been editor-in-chief since 2003, having moved the journal's site to Toronto, where it is now housed. And prior to that, having been on the board since 1999. The journal itself stems with that longevity from the beginnings, launched by Joe Brenner, some of whom you may have known, Martin Bromfenbrenner, and Warren Samuels. So it has a very august, strong legacy behind it. And of course, all of that you can find inside the front cover of the journal for the published issues and as well as on screen. But the more invisible souls yet are those who have facilitated pulling us together. And I can't but thank both Reem Munib and Robert Jordan, thank you, blanking on his name, Robert Jordan, who are here today and really have done an incredible service behind them. Thank you so much as well to Guido Niedhofer, who has been mentioned, as well as the Zentrum für Europäische Wirtschaftsforschung. And we thank everyone involved, both technically and on screen, for their assistance. So with that, we will bring our meeting to a close, and I can only thank you again.
Can I say something?
Absolutely, please, Professor Kakwani.
I have secretly come to know that Journal of Income Distribution is bringing out another special issue in honor of Peter Lambert.
Thank you so much for bringing that to the fore. Yes, we can.
And so I submitted my paper only yesterday.
Now that is a scoop that I hadn't heard, so I really appreciate that. So yes, John Creedy is shepherding that issue through as well with the help of Subramanian. So there will be again a guest edited issue coming out in honor of, yes, scholar Peter Lambert. So thank you very much for revealing the scoop, the twofold scoops that we have today to let everyone know. So we hope that that will also lead to this kind of engagement again on screen in a digital way and bring us all internationally together. And yes, I know we are all meeting together from different time zones, and therefore we will wrap this up. And thank you all so much for your engagement, your attention, and again, for your support to both the scholars who are engaged in this kind of research, as well as the publication that facilitates the dissemination of their ideas. So thank you again. It's been a delight to be a part of this and to have all of you a part of it. And again, our great, great thanks to Nanak Kakwani for all of his contributions to the field of income distribution. And thank you so much for joining us. To the best of all of you, and thank you again. We hope to see you again next meeting.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kakwani.
Thank you very much.